Jeff Bezos' risky bet on AWS that changed the internet. Welcome back to Small Cause, Big Effect. Today, we're diving into one of the most unlikely business stories ever told. Picture this. You're running the world's largest online bookstore, and somehow you end up accidentally becoming the landlord of the internet. That's not a metaphor, that's literally what happened to Jeff Bezos and Amazon. Today, when you watch Netflix, upload photos to Instagram, or even listen to this podcast, there's a good chance it's all running on Amazon Web Services, AWS. This invisible empire that most people have never heard of makes more money than McDonald's, Coca-Cola, and Nike combined. But here's the crazy part. It started because Amazon couldn't figure out how to sell books efficiently during Christmas. This is the story of how Jeff Bezos made a bet that seemed completely insane, spending billions of dollars to become a utility company when he was supposed to be selling products online. It's about how Amazon accidentally built the foundation of the modern internet while trying to solve their own problems. And it's about why sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the most mundane frustrations. Buckle up, because we're about to explore how renting computer space became more profitable than renting apartments, and why the cloud isn't actually in the sky. Act 1. The pain point. When Christmas nearly broke Amazon. To understand why AWS exists, we need to go back to the early 2000s, when Amazon was still primarily known as that website where you bought books. But here's what most people didn't realize: Amazon wasn't just selling books anymore. They were selling everything. And everything created a problem that would eventually reshape the entire internet. You see, Amazon had discovered something that every retailer learns the hard way. Christmas is both a blessing and a curse. For about 6 weeks every year, from Black Friday through New Year's, online shopping explodes. People who normally buy maybe one thing online per month suddenly need to buy 20 things for presents, decorations, and holiday parties. For traditional retailers, this is manageable. You hire seasonal workers, stock up on inventory, and pray your store doesn't get overwhelmed. But for Amazon, which was trying to serve millions of customers simultaneously through their website, Christmas was like trying to fit an elephant through a keyhole that was designed for a mouse. Here's the technical problem, explained in simple terms. Amazon's website ran on computer servers, basically powerful computers that store websites and process orders. During most of the year, they needed maybe 100 servers to handle their normal traffic. But during Christmas, they needed 1,000 servers to handle the holiday rush. So what did Amazon do? They bought 1,000 servers, which worked great for 6 weeks. But then January arrived, and suddenly Amazon had 900 servers sitting around doing absolutely nothing, like having a 20-bedroom house when you live alone. These servers cost money to buy, money to maintain, and money to keep running, even when they're not being used. It's like buying a snowplow in preparation for one blizzard per year. The snowplow is essential when you need it, but the other 360 days, it's just an expensive lawn ornament that eats money. But Jeff Bezos looked at this problem differently than most people would. Instead of thinking, how do we minimize the cost of these unused servers? He thought, how do we make money from these unused servers? And that question, that simple reframing of a problem, would eventually create an entirely new industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Most business leaders see problems as things to solve and move on from. Bezos saw problems as market opportunities that nobody else had noticed yet. The Christmas server problem wasn't just Amazon's problem, it was every growing internet company's problem. And whoever solved it first would own a massive market. Act 2. The realization. What if computing was like electricity? Around 2003, something clicked for Jeff Bezos and his team. They realized that computing power could work like electricity. Stay with me here, because this analogy is about to blow your mind and explain how AWS changed everything. Think about electricity for a moment. You don't generate your own electricity at home with a personal power plant in your backyard. That would be insane, expensive, complicated, and completely unnecessary. Instead, you buy electricity from a utility company that generates massive amounts of power and distributes it to millions of customers through the electrical grid. As before electrical utilities existed, every factory, every business, every wealthy household that wanted electricity had to generate their own power. They'd have their own generators, their own fuel supplies, their own maintenance teams. It was incredibly inefficient, but it was the only option. Then utility companies came along and said, what if we built one massive, efficient power plant and sold electricity to everyone? Suddenly, businesses could focus on their actual work instead of generating power. They could scale up or down their electricity usage based on their needs, and they only paid for what they used. Bezos realized that computing power in 2003 was exactly where electricity was in 1900. Every company that needed significant computing power, which was becoming every company, had to build their own data centers. These are basically warehouses full of computer servers with their own cooling systems, backup power, security, and technical staff. Startups would spend their first $1 million not on developing their product or marketing to customers, but on buying servers and hiring system administrators. It was like every restaurant having to build their own electrical power plant before they could turn on their ovens. But what if computing worked like electricity? What if there was a utility company for computing power where businesses could just plug in to massive, efficient data centers and only pay for the computing power they actually used? This wasn't just a nice idea. It was a massive market opportunity waiting for someone bold enough to build it. Act 3. The internal experiment. Solving your own problems first. Now, here's where the AWS story gets really interesting, because Amazon didn't start by trying to build a product for other companies. They started by trying to solve their own problems more efficiently. Amazon's internal technology team was growing frustrated with how long it took to build new features for their website. Every time they wanted to add something new, recommendation engine, a review system, a new payment option, they had to build everything from scratch. It was like being a chef who had to forge their own knives, build their own stoves, and grow their own ingredients before they could make a single meal. So Amazon's engineers started building what they called internal services, basically, pre-built components that different teams could use instead of rebuilding the same functionality over and over again. Need to store files? Use the storage service. Need to send emails? Use the messaging service. Need to process payments? Use the payment service. This approach worked so well internally that Amazon's development speed increased dramatically. New features that used to take months to build were now taking weeks. The company was becoming more efficient and more innovative simply by organizing their technology better. But then someone, and this is where the genius of Bezos' long-term thinking really shows, asked a crucial question. If these services are so useful for us, wouldn't they be useful for other companies too? This is the moment when AWS transformed from an internal efficiency project into a potential business. Amazon realized they weren't just building tools for themselves. They were building the foundation for how all internet companies could operate more efficiently. It's like if you invented a really efficient way to organize your own closet, then realized you could teach that system to everyone else and revolutionize how people think about organization. Except, instead of closets, it was the entire internet. Act 4. The leap of faith. Building the infrastructure of the future. Making the decision to turn AWS into a real business wasn't just about technology. It was about making a massive financial bet on a future that didn't exist yet. In 2006, when AWS officially launched, most people still thought of Amazon as an online retail company. The idea that Amazon would become a technology infrastructure company was like suggesting that McDonald's would become a real estate empire. It seemed completely disconnected from their core business. But Bezos understood something that most people missed. Amazon's retail business had already forced them to solve incredibly complex technology problems. They had built systems to handle millions of customers, process thousands of transactions per second, store enormous amounts of data, and deliver services reliably 24/7. These weren't just solutions to Amazon's problems. They were solutions to problems that every growing internet company would eventually face. The financial commitment was staggering. AWS required Amazon to build data centers around the world, hire thousands of engineers, and develop technology that wouldn't generate significant revenue for years. They were essentially building the electrical grid before most people even knew they needed electricity. Wall Street analysts were confused and often critical. Amazon's stock price suffered because investors couldn't understand why a retail company was spending billions on technology infrastructure. It was like shareholders asking, why is our profitable bookstore spending money to become a utility company? Bezos had learned something from Amazon's retail experience. If you can solve a problem better and cheaper than anyone else, and that problem affects millions of potential customers, you're not just building a business, you're building a market. The key insight was timing. In 2006, the internet was still young enough that most companies were just beginning to understand how much computing power they would eventually need. AWS wasn't just selling to existing demand. They were creating the infrastructure that would make new types of internet businesses possible. Active V, the early adopters. Startups in mom's basement. The first AWS customers weren't big corporations with million-dollar IT budgets. They were startups, individual developers, and small companies who couldn't afford to build their own data centers but desperately needed reliable computing. Picture this. You're a college student with an idea for the next big social media app. In the pre-AWS world, you'd need hundreds of thousands of dollars just to buy the servers to run your app, plus the technical expertise to maintain them. Most great ideas died not because they weren't good ideas, but because the barrier to entry was impossibly high. AWS changed this completely. Suddenly, that college student could launch their app for maybe $100 per month and only pay more as their app grew more popular. It was like the difference between having to buy an entire apartment building to rent one room versus being able to rent just the space you need and expand as you grow. This democratization of computing power had an effect that even Bezos probably didn't fully anticipate. It triggered an explosion of innovation. Suddenly, anyone with a good idea and basic programming skills could build and launch internet services that could scale to millions of users. Companies like Netflix, Airbnb, and Instagram, companies that now define how we live and consume entertainment, were all early AWS customers. They couldn't have existed in their current form without the infrastructure that AWS provided. It's like AWS didn't just rent out computing power, they rented out the possibility of building the future. But here's what made AWS truly revolutionary: the pricing model. Instead of charging huge upfront fees like traditional IT vendors, AWS charged by usage. You literally paid for what you used, down to the hour or even the minute. It was like turning computing from ownership into a utility service. This meant that a startup could handle sudden viral growth without going bankrupt, and established companies could experiment with new ideas without massive capital investments. The risk of trying new things dropped dramatically, which meant more people tried new things, which meant more innovation happened faster. Act 6. The flywheel effect. Getting better by getting bigger. By 2010, something remarkable was happening with AWS. The more customers they gained, the better their service became, which attracted more customers, which made their service even better. Economists call this a flywheel effect, but I prefer to think of it as a virtuous cycle of awesome. Here's how it worked. Every new customer brought AWS more revenue. That revenue allowed them to build more data centers, hire more engineers, and develop more services. More services attracted more customers, who brought more revenue, which funded more improvements. It was like a snowball rolling downhill, except instead of snow, it was innovation and market dominance. But the real genius was in the details. As AWS grew larger, they could negotiate better deals with hardware suppliers, reduce costs through economies of scale, and spread their research and development costs across millions of customers. This allowed them to continuously lower prices while improving service quality. something that's almost impossible in most industries. Traditional IT vendors were stuck in the old model. They made money by charging high prices for complex solutions that required long-term contracts and significant upfront investments. AWS flipped this model completely. They made money by making computing cheaper, easier, and more accessible for everyone. It's like the difference between selling expensive cars to a few wealthy customers versus selling affordable cars to millions of regular people. The second approach requires more innovation and efficiency, but it creates a much larger and more sustainable market. By 2015, AWS was generating over $10 billion in annual revenue and growing at 50% per year. Amazon's retail business, which had always been the company's identity, was suddenly just one part of a much larger technology empire. The bookstore had become a utility company, and the utility company was becoming more valuable than the bookstore. Act 7. The competition awakens. When giants fight. Success at AWS's scale doesn't go unnoticed. By the mid-2010s, every major technology company realized they had to compete in cloud computing or risk becoming irrelevant. Microsoft launched Azure, Google launched Google Cloud Platform, and suddenly AWS was in a three-way battle for control of the internet's infrastructure. But here's what made this competition fascinating. It wasn't just about technology or pricing. It was about fundamentally different philosophies of how computing should work. Microsoft's approach was to make cloud computing feel familiar to businesses already using Microsoft products. If you were comfortable with Windows and Office, Azure would feel like a natural extension of tools you already knew. Google's approach was to emphasize their expertise in handling massive scale and advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. They positioned Google Cloud as the choice for companies working on cutting-edge technical challenges. Amazon's approach was different. They focused on being the most comprehensive, reliable, and customer-obsessed cloud provider. AWS didn't just want to win on features or price, they wanted to win by making cloud computing so easy and reliable that switching to a competitor would be unthinkable. This competition had an interesting effect. It accelerated innovation across the entire industry. Each company was forced to continuously improve their services, lower their prices, and develop new capabilities just to keep up with their rivals. But AWS maintained their lead through what Bezos called customer obsession. While competitors focused on matching AWS's features, AWS focused on solving problems customers didn't even know they had yet. They were always building for tomorrow's needs, not just today's requirements. The result? By 2020, AWS controlled about 1/3 of the entire cloud computing market, generating over $45 billion in annual revenue and providing the infrastructure for millions of applications used by billions of people worldwide. Act 8. The invisible empire. The internet runs on Amazon. Here's something that will blow your mind. Right now, as you're listening to this podcast, you're probably using AWS without knowing it. When you stream a show on Netflix, shop on websites, use mobile apps, or even check your bank account online, there's a good chance that service is running on Amazon's servers. AWS has become what technologists call infrastructure. It's so fundamental to how the internet works that it's mostly invisible. It's like the electrical grid or the water system. You only notice it when it's not working. But unlike electricity or water, AWS is incredibly complex. They offer over 200 different services, from basic file storage to advanced artificial intelligence tools. They operate data centers on every continent except Antarctica. They process trillions of requests per day and store exabytes of data that's billions of gigabytes. To put AWS's scale in perspective, if AWS were a separate company, it would be one of the most valuable technology companies in the world, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It generates more profit than Amazon's entire retail business, despite requiring massive ongoing investments in infrastructure and research. But here's what makes AWS truly remarkable. It has enabled the creation of entire industries that couldn't have existed before. The gig economy. social media platforms, streaming services, mobile apps, artificial intelligence applications, all of these depend on the kind of reliable, scalable, affordable computing power that AWS pioneered. It's like AWS didn't just become a successful business, they became the foundation that made thousands of other successful businesses possible. They're the landlord of the digital economy, and their tenants include some of the most innovative companies in the world. This is why Bezos' bet on AWS was so brilliant. He wasn't just creating a product, he was creating an ecosystem. And once you're essential to an ecosystem, you become incredibly valuable and very difficult to replace. Conclusion: the lessons of long-term thinking. So what can we learn from Jeff Bezos' risky bet on AWS? I think there are several profound lessons here that go way beyond technology or business strategy. First, the most valuable innovations often come from solving your own problems first. AWS wasn't born from market research or competitive analysis. It emerged from Amazon's own frustrations with computing infrastructure. When you solve problems you actually experience, you understand the solution more deeply than if you're just guessing what other people might want. Second, sometimes the biggest opportunities look like distractions from your main business. In 2006, building cloud computing services looked like a crazy departure from Amazon's retail focus. But Bezos understood that enabling other companies to build better online services would ultimately make the entire internet economy larger and more successful, including Amazon's retail business. Third, infrastructure businesses can be incredibly powerful because they benefit from what economists call network effects. The more people use AWS, the more valuable it becomes for everyone. This creates natural barriers to competition and sustainable competitive advantages that are very difficult to overcome. Fourth, timing matters enormously, but not in the way most people think. AWS succeeded not because Amazon picked the perfect moment to launch, but because they started building the infrastructure before most people realized they would need it. By the time the market was ready for cloud computing, AWS was already years ahead of any potential competitor. But maybe the most important lesson is about the power of long-term thinking. AWS required Amazon to invest billions of dollars for years before it generated significant revenue. Wall Street criticized these investments, competitors dismissed them as distractions, and even some Amazon employees questioned whether it made sense. But Bezos was playing a different game than everyone else. While others were optimizing for quarterly earnings, he was building for decades. While others were focused on immediate returns, he was creating the infrastructure for future growth that hadn't been imagined yet. This long-term perspective is what separates truly transformative companies from merely successful ones. Most businesses react to market conditions as they exist today. Revolutionary businesses create the market conditions they want to exist tomorrow. The story of AWS is ultimately about having the courage to make big bets on uncertain futures. In 2006, nobody knew that cloud computing would become a hundreds of billions dollar industry. Nobody predicted that AWS would become more profitable than Amazon's retail business. Nobody imagined that a bookstore would become the backbone of the internet. But Jeff Bezos didn't need to predict the future with perfect accuracy. He just needed to understand that the future would require better, cheaper, more accessible computing power, and he needed to be willing to build that future even when others couldn't see it yet. Today, AWS processes more internet traffic than most countries. It enables innovations we haven't imagined yet. It has democratized access to computing power in ways that have accelerated human progress. And it all started because Jeff Bezos was frustrated that Amazon's website crashed every Christmas. That's it for today's episode of Small Cause, Big Effect. Remember, sometimes the most revolutionary ideas start with the most mundane problems. The next time you're frustrated by something that seems broken or inefficient, ask yourself, what if this problem is actually an opportunity that nobody else has noticed yet? And who knows? Maybe your frustration today will become tomorrow's billion-dollar business. Maybe you'll build the infrastructure that makes the next generation of innovations possible. maybe you'll create something so fundamental to how the world works that future entrepreneurs will build their dreams on the foundation you're laying today. Until next time, keep thinking long-term, keep solving real problems, and remember, the cloud isn't in the sky. It's in a warehouse in Virginia, and it's probably running on Amazon Web Services.